It's RFK Jr. He's an environmental lawyer, law professor, activist, best-selling author, and from 1986 to 2017, he served as a senior attorney for the Natural Resources Defense Council and was the chief prosecuting attorney for Hudson Riverkeeper. He is a professor emeritus of environmental law at Pace University School of Law. He's also the founder and chairman of Children's Health Defense, an advocacy group challenging the dominant narratives around vaccines and vaccination. He's the author of a dozen published books, including the best-selling The Real Anthony Fauci, Bill Gates, Big Pharma, and the Global War on Democracy and Public Health. Kennedy is running for the Democratic Party's nomination for president. Welcome to the show. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me, Jimmy, and thanks for being such an incredible leader and so courageous about all of these issues during the lockdowns. I watch your show regularly. I think um, I think myself and a lot of Americans got a lot of hope. You were the first guy who was being funny about it, and the humor is such an important part of change and criticism and political dissent. And it was weird what happened to I'm sure you noticed this, that all these comedians stopped being funny at the beginning of COVID. All the people who we laughed at for 20 years, and none of them were funny anymore because they weren't allowed to laugh at what was happening, what was really happening. They all had to go along with the narrative. It was shocking. And then it was a few kind of right-wing comedians that, were the only ones who were talking about it. But all of the people who, I admired and grew up with, and, you were one of the few liberals who were doing it, who were speaking out. But, as for Jimmy Kimmel and Colbert and, all of those guys, they went dead. What happened?
I feel like they let down comedy. Now I know Jimmy Kimmel. I haven't talked to him for probably 15 years, but he was a sweetheart of a guy. I always thought he was a nice guy. He was nice to me, and so it was a heartbreak to see that. And Stephen Colbert was a hero of mine comedically. I thought that show he did was the best satirical comedy show in the history.
Yeah.
And turns out he became that character when he started hosting his late night show on CBS. He became the character he used to be, just repeats talking points and establishment. I mean, it was nuts to watch. It was heartbreaking. And so I appreciate the nice words from you on that. And I feel, I used to always be very proud to be a member of the stand-up comedy community. And boy, it really left me. I got embarrassed to see comedians go on stage and shame people for reading. Can you imagine that? Comedians. And so, yeah, it was a real heartbreaker. And, but, I took took it on the chin, a lot of friends, but, you've been going through that for much longer than me. So I can't complain. But I wanted to talk to you. There's a lot of things that everybody's talked about, a lot of things with you. You've been on our show twice already, so we've covered a lot of stuff. But I'm interested, if you don't mind. So, when you were addicted and then you got sober, did you go to a program to do that, or how did that happen?
Well, I went to a rehab in September of 1983, and weirdly, it was a rehab that was not a 12-step rehab, and it was a strange process that I don't think anybody uses anymore. But I ended up leaving there and then going into 12-step programs.
Oh, okay.
And so I've been doing that for 40 years, and I do a lot of it's a sort of central organizing function of my life. I go to meetings every day. I start every morning, go to an early morning meeting, and then I do my meditations while I hike. So I do that, which is important to me, and kind of organize my existence around that and my day, and try to keep, even with all the Sturm and Drang and the hurly-burly and all of the, the weird things that happen in my life, to try to stay on that kind of spiritual keel, try to walk with one one foot in the material world and the other in the spiritual world, and and try to keep
Quite a
peaceful.
trick. Quite a
Yeah,
trick if you can pull that off. I heard you talk about, so I'm a big fan of Carl Jung, and
yeah.
we share the same birthday, so that's a synchronicity. And so I heard you talk about that Carl Jung helped you awaken spiritually or kind of reconnect spiritually. Can you talk a little bit about that?
First of all, I knew that I needed to have a spiritual realignment because I didn't want, I started taking drugs soon after my dad's death. And I started when I was 15 years old. But from the beginning, and I got addicted very quickly. I had a very quick progression. So I was using intravenous heroin within, when I was 15 years old. And but I always was remorseful about it. I always was trying to get off of it. I knew that it was not what I wanted to do with my life. And I had iron willpower in every other aspect of my life. I've talked about this, that I gave up candy for Lent when I was 13 years old. I didn't eat candy again until I was in college. I gave up desserts the following year and did not eat another dessert till I was a freshman in college, and I was playing rugby and trying to bulk up. So I started eating, desserts again. But I felt like I had iron willpower. I could do anything with it. But somehow this compulsion was impervious to it. And I would say the most demoralizing part of addiction is the incapacity to keep contracts with yourself. So I would say at 9 o'clock in the morning, I am never going to do that again. And I would say it honestly, sincerely, earnestly.
Mhm.
And at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, I'd be doing what I
Mhm.
promised I wouldn't do. And it was cunning, baffling, powerful. I could not understand what was happening. And I, I had been raised with in a very, Catholic, pious, and I had a very good experience with the Catholic Church from when I was a kid. I never had any trauma or anything. The priests, the nuns that I was exposed to were, were generally incredibly admirable people. And so I never had any of these traumas that took other people away from the church. But when you're living against conscience, as I was, God tends any conception that you have of God tends to recede to the peripheries of your life, because there's just not room for it, and it does. You're living against conscience. Well, I knew I didn't like being an addict. I wanted to stop, and but I couldn't go into a 12-step program because of my who I was and kind of I for me it would seem crazy for somebody with my experience to walk into a group of strangers and start talking about your personal issues, because my experience with that was somebody would put it in the newspapers, and it would be reckless for me to
Mhm.
do it. But I got arrested when I was 28 years old, September of 1983. And at that point, the cat was out of the bag. So there was no barrier to me then going in and, into 12-step program. And that's what I did. I started going to meetings. I knew from the beginning that I wanted to have a spiritual realignment. And the 12 steps are built to induce a spiritual awakening of one kind or another, very personalized. There's no cosmology, there's no religion, but basically they encourage you to, they ease your path at finding your own spiritual path, your own relationship with a God of whatever your understanding is. I knew I wanted that kind of realignment because I did not want to be out on the street again, like wanting a drug and then just of having to white knuckle it and say, I'm not, not
Mhm.
going to do it. I didn't want to be struggling with it. I wanted to be like a
Mhm.
regular person who woke up in the morning and, said hi to the family and ate breakfast and was not struggling with a compulsion all day. And I knew that throughout history, there had been people who had had these spiritual awakenings that had taken them away from addiction. St. Augustine, I'd read the Confessions, and he, had this incredibly debauched childhood. He was a sex addict until he was 30 years old, and a drug and an alcoholic. St. Francis had kind of a wild youth. The same thing. He was a party guy, and they had these spiritual awakenings that had lifted their compulsions away. So, and I knew many, many. I'd read the lives of the saints, so that's a persistent theme. And I had a friend who was the best friend of my little brother, David, who died of this disease. And but this friend of his used to take drugs with the same compulsion that I did, and he became a Mooney at one point, and he joined the Unification Church and became a disciple of Reverend Sun Myung Moon, but he would still hang out with us, and he would watch us take drugs in the same room what we're doing, but he had no desire to do it. He completely lifted from him, and he would sit there and chatter about his stuff, his views, um, and and I used to think, but he didn't want it, and he was free from the compulsion. And I used to think about this guy when I first got sober, and I'd say, and this, evinces the kind of the narrowness and judgmentalness of my mind at that time. But I would say to myself, I would rather be dead than be a Mooney. But I wish that somehow I could get whatever it was that he had to distill that power that he had that allowed him to escape the compulsion without becoming a religious nuisance. And and that's when when I was having those thoughts, I picked up this book and it was an act of synchronicity. I picked it up off a table. I don't know who left it there, but it was a book called Synchronicity by Carl Jung, and it was my first real exposure to Jung. Of course, I'd heard of Jung like any educated person had, but I really didn't know much about him. And the reason I read that book is because the Police had an album out by the same name that just had come out, and I didn't know what the word meant, so I wanted to read about it. And Jung, was, as you know, Jung was he was a disciple of Freud's, and they were kind of the co-fathers of modern psychiatry. But unlike Freud, who was an atheist, and really, what I would say to people who want to read about Jung is they should not read Synchronicity. They should read Jung's biography, which is called
Dream.
Memories, Dreams,
And something else, yes.
and something else, the three things. But anyway, which is fascinating.
That's the first book I read of us.
Yeah, his life, because his father was a preacher, but he was a rote preacher, and he never had an authentic spiritual experience. And whereas Jung always knew that his father was miserable, and his father, at the end of his life, lost all of his faith, and just saw his entire life as one long act of hypocrisy. But he was a genius at kind of repeating the kind of religious mantras of the time, from the podium, and checking all the dots, but he never had an authentic spiritual experience. Whereas Jung began having these experiences. When you read his book, he has these vivid recollections of these intense spiritual experiences that he had from when he was 3 or 4 years old. And his memory of them is absolute. His recollection of them is absolute. A lot of them occurred during dreams, but also other things happened to him. And a lot of those were synchronicities. One of these experiences that happened later on in his life, which he describes in that book, Synchronicity, he ran the biggest sanitarium in Europe. And he's sitting up on the 3rd floor in Zurich with with a patient of his who's a woman, and she's talking about a dream that she had, and dreams were the sort of the centerpiece dream interpretation of his brand of psychiatry. And by the way, he played a critical role in crafting the spiritual dimensions of the AA program, which was the first 12-step program, because he treated a guy called Roland Hazard, who was a Boston businessman and was Bill Wilson's best friend. And Roland Hazard went in, was a very successful businessman who went to get treatment 3 times from Jung, and then each time thought he was cured of alcoholism, left, and with days or weeks, he was, full-blown binge again, and finally he came back and he said to Jung, he said, "Level with me. Is there any hope for anybody like with my level of alcoholism?" And Jung said, "There isn't. It's hopeless." And Hazard presses him and he says, "Is there ever in history in somebody with my level of alcoholism who actually overcomes?" And Jung said, "Yeah, but it happens infrequently and only with people who have profound spiritual realignments." And Hazard shared that with Bill Wilson, and Bill Wilson then began a correspondence with Jung, which is really interesting. And Jung is mentioned in the big book of Alcoholics Anonymous in one of the key chapters where they talk about, the sort of the evolution of the spiritual dimensions of AA. So, so Jung is sitting in this room with a with a patient. The fulcrum of her dream is a scarab beetle, which is a common item of iconography in the hieroglyphics of Egypt and the tombs and the obelisks, etc. But it's a rare, if not completely extirpated creature in Northern Europe, where he was at that time. You never see him there. And while he's speaking to her and she's describing this dream, he's hearing this ping, ping, ping on the window behind him. And he doesn't want to turn and take his attention off the patient, but it's getting him irritated. And finally, in exasperation, he stands and he throws open the window, and a scarab beetle flies in and lands in his palm. And he turns to her, he shows it to her, and he said, "Is this what you were dreaming about?" And he kind of it was a little bit of a revelation for him because he said the chance of that happening are 1 in a trillion, right? And so it just violated the laws of mathematics, of nature, of probability. These are natural laws. And so something had violated a natural law, which has to be supernatural. And he kind of looked at that experience as God reaching in, violating his own laws occasionally to come in and tap people on the shoulder and say, "I'm here." And that was sort of God's way of communicating with his children, his spiritual children. Oh, Young man, because he's a spiritual guy, very deeply spiritual, but he also has this other part of him that is a very faithful scientist. And so he starts these experiments to try to reproduce that experience in a clinical setting. So he puts one guy in one room and another guy in the other room and has them flip cards, playing cards, and then try to guess what the other guy flipped. And he believes that if he can beat the laws of probability, that he will have proven the existence of a supernatural, which is the first step to proving the existence of a God. And he tries to do that, but he says in this book, which is very impressive, that he couldn't do it. But he does say this. He says, "Even though I can't use empirical tools and scientific tools to prove the existence of a God, I can prove that people who believe in God have, based upon case studies of thousands of patients that he'd seen and anecdotal evidence that people have come through his sanitarium, that people who believe in God and get better faster, and that the recovery is more durable than people who do not." And for me, that was an incredibly impactful thing to hear, and much more impactful than if he said that he believed that he had proven the existence of a God, which I would not have believed. But at that point in my recovery, I had made a commitment to myself that I was going to do anything that improved my chances of recovery by even 1%. So if believing in God would improve that recovery, then I was going to do it. So then I was presented with the problem: how do you start believing in something that you can't see or smell or taste or touch or smell or acquire with your senses? And Jung solves that problem. He says, you fake it till you make it. You act as if, and that the obedience precedes the evidence. So, and that obedience to, to a God, that compliance with the way that God wants us to behave will then be will is an act of faith, because you're doing it based on faith, and that, but you will see the evidence presently. And so I started living my life. I just said, okay, I'm going to do this. I'm going to act as if there's a God up there watching me 24 hours a day, and that life is just a series of tests, and that that every day is I would break down into about 40 different decisions, and I invested each one of those decisions with a moral dimension. So I would say, for example, when the alarm goes off in the morning, do I stay in bed with my indolent and, pornographic thoughts maybe, or do I jump right out of bed and, get the day going? Um, do I hang up the towels after I get out of my shower? Do I, clean up the bathroom? Do I brush my teeth? And do I put the water in the ice tray before I put the ice tray back in the freezer? When I reach into the closet and pull out a pair of blue jeans, and all the little wire hangers fall on the floor, do I go in there and hang them up, or do I say that's somebody else's job? I'm too busy for that. I'm too important for that. And, do I put the shopping cart back where the shopping cart is supposed to go? And these are like the most important things that, what I find is when I do the little things right, that God takes care of the big things. About 6 weeks after I got sober, I was, my life began to get, was got addiction makes your life very small. And my life began to get big quickly. And I was running through National Airport, and I was late for a plane. It was mission critical. I had to be on that plane or something catastrophic was going to happen. I don't remember what it was now. But as I was running, I was putting a stick of Dentyne in my mouth, and I balled up the wrapper, and I was running past a trash can, and I threw the wrapper, and it made a perfect arc right swish into the middle of the trash can. But as I was running past, I saw it must have hit something in there, and it bounced back out. And I said to myself, "Well, that's God's fault because I made the shot." But I was, and I had to get that plane. So I was running, and maybe 40, 50, 60 steps later, it just started eating at me. And I finally I put the brakes on, and I went back and put the wrapper in. And for me, I did make the plane. But for me, probably the most important thing I did that day was to put that wrapper back in that trash can, because that is, staying in that posture of surrender, um, even when the cash and prize are flowing into your life, which is the hard part. Because for me, I came in on my knees saying, God, I need your help. And, but then, the cash and prizes start flowing in, your life gets together. And my inclination is to say, thanks, God, I got it from here. And then take the wheel and drive the car off the cliff again. And the challenge is, for somebody like me, it's how do you stay in that posture of surrender, even when, maintain that spiritual connection, even when your life is going well and you don't really need, you don't need God in your life anymore. And that, we all, addiction is ultimately about abusing power. And we're all given certain powers. You have the power to make people laugh. People have, and your incredible good looks, and people have
Thank God
education.
somebody said it.
people people have education, they have connections, they have money, they have a good job, whatever the power is. Are you using that to serve yourself well, or are you using it to serve something bigger than yourself, the community, or whatever whatever your vision of God is? And that's the challenge, is how do we keep using that even when even as the power grows and magnifies and amplifies, how do we make sure it's not being deployed to serve selfish ends, but it's, being being deployed for some higher purpose.
You talk about surrender. I never understood what that meant until I read Carl Jung and started to experience my unconscious. And he talks about that what we're aware of is uh, is just the tip of the iceberg of who we really are, and that most of who we are is unconscious, and that to become enlightened isn't to learn something new, but is to make the darkness conscious, right? And so I've experienced that my ego consciousness, the thing is tiny compared to the unconscious and the God, right? If you want to call that, right? And I've realized that I finally understand, like, oh, what I what I don't control anything, right? All I can do, like with my consciousness, all I can do is surf a wave. Like like God is this wave, or God is creating this wave of consciousness, and I can surf it, but I can't control that wave. And I'm a part of it. I'm part of the ocean. I'm part of the consciousness. But the real surrender is to know that I don't have control, and that the same God that creates my dreams at night is the same God that creates my life, and I don't have that. And so, just like I have this one Jungian has this technique of, how you interpret a dream. Well, if something happens in your life, just pretend like it's a dream, and then how would you interpret that? What just happened to you, as if, and that has really changed my life, right? To look at everything that's happening in my life as coming from God, because it is. And that was my experience with Jung, and it really opened me up. And he also explained romantic love to me. I don't know if you've read his theories on the anima and animus projection, and that's the religious experience. And have you read about that yet?
No.
It's really unbelievable. It makes you understand what the hell's been going on with you. It makes you understand why you fall in love, why you fall out of love, why it doesn't stay, why he calls it about the anima projection. It's the female part of you, and it's like the perfect woman in your unconscious. You project that, because we find out about who we are by projection. We're projecting all the time. And so, and then you're really falling in love with yourself. You're falling in love with an unconscious version of the female that you have inside of you. And so that's why it's looked at as, a religious experience, because you're rejoining your consciousness, your conscious mind with your unconscious anima. And so that's why it feels like that. And that's why it feels like you're being stimulated from the inside. And anyway, so it was remarkable to me to learn about that. And Carl Jung has saved my life too. So he gave it meaning anyway. He connected me back to my spirituality, because I was a Sam Harris atheist. I was one of those guys, and I rebelled against Catholicism because I didn't have that good experience that you had with Catholicism. It was not good. And I mean, most of the nuns were okay, most of the priests were okay, but overall, it wasn't a good experience. My uncle was a priest, but anyway, he was a good guy. But anyway, all right. Well, it was really great to talk to you about that, and it's good to I
Yeah,
like.
I mean, we could talk for days about that, because
Yeah,
even with the things that you were just talking about, I had so many sort of wonderful thoughts about, and it's great to be able to talk about that stuff on television.
yeah.